Good morning, everybody from around Australia, and even a few of the people we've got attending remotely. Welcome to this webinar that is being hosted by Insync with friends from Microsoft, AvePoint, and WyattApp, where we'll be talking about governance and compliance for Microsoft Teams in education, which is quite the hot topic at the moment. So on the agenda, first up, we'll have Dan Bowen from Microsoft talking about what the opportunities are for Microsoft Teams in education, followed by myself, Loryan Strant, where I'll be talking about Teams in the real world, what we've been seeing, what we've been hearing from different organizations I work with, as well as Daryl Clark from AvePoint around the provisioning, governance, lifecycle management of Microsoft Teams, so a full end-to-end discussion there. And finally, with Matt Pasternak from WyattApp in the US, where it's currently evening for him, talking about how we protect data and people before it becomes a problem. So focusing on how we actually manage and monitor the content there. So just a quick piece of housekeeping. This session is being recorded. And while there is a Q&A panel, we'll be holding all questions until the end. After the webinar, we'll actually be sending out a link to the recording, to the slides, as well as any follow-up information that will be relevant. So just quickly, how this webinar actually came about. So recently I published a webinar, a ebook, sorry, with AvePoint about Teams in education. And through that, through the research for that ebook, I spoke with a number of higher education institutions as well as K-12 institutions about how they were managing Teams, what the challenges were that they saw. And what really came out of it was I saw there was a lack of management around Teams, even also like a lack of planning, and in some cases a fundamental lack of understanding of how Teams works and what it integrates with and the dependent services. Some institutions were holding off on deploying Teams because they didn't fully understand it. Some had started deploying with some good control measures in place, and a number were concerned where they had already let it be unleashed. So one particular institution I spoke to had found several hundred Teams had been created before the IT department even knew what the functionality was in the service. So what I thought was a great idea was to put together a webinar where we cover off those topics and give you what you need in a nutshell to go away and be better educated and be in a better position to deploy Teams for your institution. So with that, I will hand over to Dan Bowen.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Loryan. And thanks to everybody for joining today. Really appreciate it. Like I said in the IM, we've seen a huge adoption of Teams at the minute in Australia and globally. And, when you think about Office and you sit back and think about the kind of capabilities, when I was the Office lead in Australia and we were looking at implementing, Office 365 and Office 2016 at that point, and really trying to move workforces forward, across education, across universities, K-12, as well as the commercial space. We've kind of seen a real transformation, and the amount of step up the Teams has created for schools and education establishments has been phenomenal, really, and we've seen a really great adoption. Because what Teams is, as you all know, and I don't want to teach you all to suck eggs because we're here to understand about the kind of ways we can govern the Teams mentality, in terms of being able to sit across the product set around Office and then actually be able to connect, collaborate, and actually really meet kind of students' needs with additional functionality in education. So, to kind of highlight some of those quickly as well. When we're looking at Teams, generally, we're talking about looking at the way that we can make people, and that's teachers and admins, and sometimes we miss the administrators out to this, but all your staff in your school save time, collaborate better, be able to work more effectively together across your teams, and actually connect better together. So trying to wean people off certain areas. For example, we all know the kind of pain that we get when we wake up in the morning, we grab a mobile phone, we check our email. People get into this kind of big cycle of email checking, and and getting caught up in the kind of frenzy of that, and running the day through email. And obviously from a teacher's point of view, they may not get access, or a lecturer's point of view, they may not get time to check their emails till the end of the day. So how can we kind of facilitate better collaboration, better communication? And Teams is a way to kind of a glue that sits in between Office and a lot of our kind of end users now, to make them be able to interact with some of the tools such as SharePoint and the communication tools you've got on site, and then also between, you know, Word, PowerPoint, and Excel and things. So really interesting features, but you know, and I personally believe this is a real transformational tool the schools and the education sector is using all that. And also, like I said, we've got these educational features, for example, the assignment setting within side Teams now, which we are kind of putting a lot of investment into changing the kind of rubrics, the assessment marking, and the assignment setting, and all of that kind of stuff. The question that comes up to me quite regularly as well with Teams is, you know, are Microsoft playing in the LMS space? Well, you know, in your own kind of schools, you want your different kind of capabilities from your different software. Obviously, we giving you some of that functionality, but again, you know, depending on, you know, the kind of level of integration you want, our Office suite connects in with your LMSs like Canvas really nicely as well. So in terms of the kind of educational features, there's heaps of features we're fitting in there, and we are developing at the same time in that education space. And you know, hopefully, you know, the teachers that are using them in your schools are really enjoying them. You know, and the integrations with some of the educational applications, which we've got coming up, are quite exciting as well. You know, highlighting some of the features and trying to kind of get people to kind of chat more and conference more through Teams is really kind of fundamental a part of Teams, like we're doing now. And the reason why we've run this webinar through Teams is to illustrate that functionality. Lots of schools are trying to communicate with, you know, some of the Indigenous communities, some other local schools, bringing experts in, bringing guest users into their teams to kind of collaborate with them, connecting with parents. So being able to kind of utilize some of the light touch chat, for example, rather than getting, like I said earlier on, people caught up with the email threads, and trying to get contextual conversations going is vital. And we've seen a lot of opportunities for that as well. And obviously it's that integration with the apps. So for you teachers who struggle with Office 365, jumping into, you know, Word, PowerPoint, Flow, Power Apps, all of the different tools, Sway and things, you know, it's all integrated in that one pane of glass. And we're finding that actually the usage of Office and the more effective use of Office, you know, because where we've struggled in the past is that people haven't really used some of our productivity tools effectively enough by utilizing things like OneDrive. You know, from an IT admin point of view, this should then, you see lots of usage, but then you'll be able to actually utilize some of the advanced features like Delve. So when all teachers are using things like Teams and you're all part of the groups, then you can utilize those features like Delve, so you can see, you know, which teachers have done really good biology, volcano presentations in science, or, you know, heart presentations, or whatever it may be that geography teachers can work with, or utilize, or maths teachers or physics teachers. So we've seen a better usage of the Office applications, because this lens allows you to kind of stay inside that kind of pane of glass, and integrate across your entire stack. So that integration is really good. And then, you know, finally, the other opportunity we're seeing is obviously the way you can customize and extend your teams inside Microsoft Teams by additional apps which we've got in the store, which can support you from an IT point of view, for example, using some of the functionalities of integrated help desks. You know, you can create a team for your help desk, for example, and run some of those kind of features. You can jump to websites, so teachers are kind of having their Year 7 maths group, and then having several websites that, you know, say Kahoot or Mathletics and some of the other sites already there, but also some of the integrated apps, and even going down to the lines of kind of integrating chatbots into there, and creating their own chatbots, so the parents can go in and ask questions, or students can go in and even create their own chatbots. So Teams is providing us with a really amazing lens on Office, and it's really giving educational capabilities now to schools, and hopefully you're seeing a lot of those innovations happening. Obviously, from our point of view, and the reason why we care about putting on these webinars is because we work very heavily with Insync Technology to kind of really drive a lot of really good use cases of Teams, because if you use it well, you know, in the background, it is to do with all your groups, it's to do with all your security, and a lot of that security can be managed inside your Office 365 environment, but also there are other third-party tools that allow you to extend on that, which we look at today. So there's a whole heap of functions that hopefully you're loving in education and is really driving some outcomes. We'd love to hear any stories that you doing and using Teams in Australia. And with that, I'll put some resources up that we'll share with you as well. You know, if you were utilizing Teams in your school, don't forget we have learning consultants that can come and support you in terms of professional development. And we also have partners that can support with that. We have a lot of online training in our educator community, and a whole heap of blogs and teacher training events that we actually have running to support your use of Teams. Because obviously it's not just about the Teams, the product, it's all the products that sit underneath there. So hopefully today's webinar is going to whet your appetite, and also, you know, from our point of view, you know, we're getting questions about people thinking about governance around Teams and how to get control of that, and from an IT administrative point of view, how to support with that. And hopefully that'll answer some of your questions. And if not, while we're talking, please pop some of those questions in the Q&A as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. So as I kind of alluded to right at the start, I've spoken with a number of organizations around how they use Microsoft Teams or their concerns around Microsoft Teams. So obviously, we're seeing a lot of conversation around Microsoft Teams. The product itself is about 18 months old from when it went to general availability. One of the things that's important to note is that it is not just a replacement for Skype for Business. So a lot of the conversation around Teams is being had by traditional systems integrators and Microsoft partners, and especially those who focus on Skype for Business, because effectively that product has been given its marching orders. While there's no real sunset date around when Skype for Business will be, or Skype for Business Online will be depreciated. Already we're starting to see a lot of that functionality appear in Teams, and a lot of functionality inside of Teams that doesn't exist in Skype for Business. So the thing that is important to note is, as I said, it is not the same as Skype for Business. Yes, the same functionality exists, but Teams, as Dan said, is a lot more than just a voice messaging and communication platform. It's a true collaborative experience. One of the things that we do tend to have inside of Office 365, and you may have seen a lot of this, is the whole what to use when, because there's overlap between, you know, as I just said, Skype for Business and Teams, but there's also overlap between Yammer and Teams. And then people start to get confusion around team sites in SharePoint versus Teams, which create an Office 365 group, which creates a team site. So there's a bit of confusion around when they should be using SharePoint versus OneDrive versus Teams. And one of the terms that we see is that the Teams is referred to as an app hub, because it actually surfaces all those. And in theory, you should be able to spend most of your day sitting inside of Microsoft Teams and not have to go into these other interfaces. What I have seen is a lot of organizations really aren't aware of how to deploy Teams in the best way, how to name things, how to work with the compliance features out of the box, whether those compliance and governance features are sufficient for them. And so, you know, some institutions have simply thrown their hands up and just said, we just don't know what to do, we'll let the users figure it out. Others said, we don't know what to do, we'll turn it off. So from my experience with myself, with Insync, so we actually sit across a number of different programs, both within Microsoft and Telstra, called TAP programs, technical adoption programs. So we get early access to things. I also sit inside of an internal TAP within Microsoft, which actually gives me access to what's called Ring 1.5. So within the development rings of Teams and deployment, there's actually 5 different rings. There's Ring 0, which is the developers using live code, through to Ring 4, which is the average end user. So not targeted release people, early adopters. This is the average user who gets access to the functionality. So me personally, I sit inside what's called Ring 1.5. So I see code that is largely safe to use, but is not nowhere near available for public consumption. So with that, I actually do a lot of work with Microsoft and give feedback to them on features like this, on how do we, the experience with Teams live event. We get to test things out. So background blur, for example, is a feature that was made available a couple of weeks ago when it was announced at Ignite, but it's a feature I've been using for a while. So a lot of those features we get to see and play with and see what's coming down the pipeline and how that affects people. As I also mentioned earlier, I did a lot of research for the ebook that I wrote with AvePoint around how organizations are using Teams or why they're not using Teams. And it's something that we with Insync have been doing as well, is having a lot of customers who are on Skype for Business that are now looking at saying, well, how do we use Teams? Well, the conversation has to move beyond that. So we've been doing a lot of research as to how that actually how that translates to the real world for them. And so I also do a lot of presenting with Microsoft and with the community on Microsoft Teams. So I sit amongst a number of Microsoft MVPs. So we do a lot of writing and sharing and experiences that are not just within Australia, but also around the world. So how is an organization of hundreds of thousands of students managing Teams versus a small independent school of 1,200 students? So there's a lot of experiences that we get to call on there. One of the things that was a statistic that was made available at Ignite is that Teams is the fastest growing business app in Microsoft history. So there's already, as you can see, there's several 100,000 organizations using Teams. And that's not just somebody has installed it and had a go at it. This is active users, active organizations that have multiple teams that are being used on a daily basis. The Fortune 100 doesn't apply to us down under, but we've got our own rating. But a lot of organizations, public sector, private sector, government, education are using it. There's a lot of support for languages inside of Teams. That's one of the things that Microsoft has worked on quite a lot, is multi-language support. In that now, one of the things you can do is Dan, for example, can type something to me in Welsh and it will translate it to me in English Australian. Or I can use my native language of Russian and actually type that. And that can actually convert to English for other people as well. So it's it is really quite a hot topic. A lot of people talking about it, and as a result, there's a lot of growth. So the thing that we've just got to be cognizant of is that it doesn't become another shadow IT application where the users just let loose on it and IT has no control and things kind of get lost. So I mentioned Ignite recently. So I saw a lot of different experiences at Ignite. So I actually got to work at the Microsoft Ignite or the Microsoft Teams booth at Ignite, and also the education booth specifically. And so what I saw is, as I mentioned a few times, was the awareness. So I had one attendee specifically come up to me and say, hey, where's the Skype for Business booth? Is Teams replacing it or something? And that was actually announced at Ignite the previous year. So some people still aren't aware of that. Some people weren't aware of the relation between Office 365 groups and Teams. Definitely, as I said before, a lot of confusion around that. Also confusion around the future direction. Should I invest heavily in Teams now or invest in it later? Should we keep using Skype for Business? And there's a lot of different opinions that were, I guess what I saw was fueled by a lack of knowledge. Like one person referred to Teams as a discussion board. Which is really almost the bare bones of the feature. If you took everything away and left it with just the chat, that would be a discussion feature. But we already got that level of functionality in tools like of Yammer. So one of the things that's really important to note is with Teams is how things have changed. So we don't live in a world where we're micromanaged, where our managers tell us exactly how to do things, and especially in education. It's not the teacher's job to tell the student exactly how to do things. It's their job to facilitate a learning experience and allow the student's mind to grow and to find their own way using the frameworks and the knowledge that's been applied. So what we see is from an IT perspective as well, how do we look at that when it comes to things like Microsoft Teams? Historically, IT has told the business, the education, the users, ultimately how to use the tools and what tools to use. That doesn't translate into today's world where people can effectively vote with their fingers, where they can go off and find tools like Slack, like Trello, like Chatter, like any other tool they can, because they can just go out and sign up for it on the web. So while it's important for IT to have control of Teams, it's not as relevant to have IT dictate how teams works in an organization, especially in education, where there's a lot of free-flowing knowledge and a lot of innovation that's occurring in those young minds. So this is where we have to look at how this is managed. Now, this particular slide was actually borrowed from a TEDx talk about chaos. And ultimately what it's saying is chaos is actually not a bad thing. It's actually loosely connected actions and events that form something. So this is the reality that we live in, is Teams is not chaotic. It fosters chaos, but a good type of chaos. So what we effectively need to do between IT and education is have that effectively controlled chaos. Allow people to work the way they want, allow them to learn the way they want, but foster that environment. So hence why we thought it was so important to look at these solutions from AvePoint Wiretap as to how IT and the education institution can effectively control that chaos. So with that, I'll hand over to Daryl from AvePoint.
Thank you, Loryan. Right. So look, Teams has easily been the product out of all the things that I get asked to speak to customers about. The growth has been absolutely huge. So often in my role at AvePoint, we get to talk about migration and things like that, some of the common things, but everyone seems to, if they haven't rolled out Teams, if they're using Office 365, they're talking about doing it and a little bit unsure and things like that. I think part of the reason for that is it is so easy to use, but also, with that being easy to use, which is driving consumption and adoption, there's some challenges that potentially come with that as well. So look, I haven't put this slide up to scare or anything like that, but this sort of illustrates to me, what we're trying to avoid, where there are so many teams created that users don't know which one to use. Sort of the example Loryan gave before, where there was an institution where a whole bunch of teams got created without IT even knowing it. That's a really, really common one. There was a university down in Melbourne that they didn't do a launch. There was no comms plan, no training, anything like that. And they had 600 teams created in 2 months. And half of those were names of the vice chancellor or test _test, all those sorts of things. And if you look at like what we used to see with on-premises SharePoint, people would go, hey, this thing's really great and easy to use. Press this new button that says new site. I wonder what this does. And before we'd know it, we'd end up with all these subsites and things created with no naming convention and no real way for the end user to know, is this where I should be working? Is this a single source of truth? So things can quickly become a mess. The same, so tying that back, the same problem is obviously happening a lot with Teams. So we're seeing a lot of customers where they're either turning it on or they're not even aware that it is on. And a lot of the time, like the term I've heard a few times from customers that, the horse is bolted, what can we do? So I wanted to show this slide here. I think it's a really, really good one that it sort of illustrates that not all groups are created equal. So one of the challenges that often happens is that depending where you go in Office 365, you get a different experience and a different outcome for when an Office 365 group is created. So when you create a team, there's an Office 365 group associated with that. So one of the great things is that the way Microsoft designed Office 365 is that you can get up and running really, really quickly. So if you're in Outlook, you can create a group. If you're in Yammer, whatever the case may be, so sort of get up and running. Now, part of the challenge with that is that it's an inconsistent outcome of what actually happens when you provision one of those groups. So one that I've sort of heard a lot is people have gone into Yammer, created a group in there, have a whole bunch of members working on something, go, okay, now let's go and use Teams. And I'm like, well, you can't use that same group. So what typically happens is another Office 365 group gets created via Teams that has the exact same membership and probably a very similar name to the one that was created with Yammer. So quite quickly, we start seeing what would happen with the on-premises Active Directory, where there's a whole bunch of groups created and it potentially becomes a little bit of a mess and very hard for IT to control and even harder for end users to navigate. So what we've got here is where does AvePoint sit within an overall IT governance model? So look, one of the things that needs to be done is to put some controls and some governance around how teams are created and who is allowed to do so, who's allowed to go and create those teams. So with that in mind, we've sort of developed an approach where it says, well, we sit within that overall IT organizational-wide governance model. So typically, every organization has a governance model or framework that sits across everything. So within there, you've got your operational governance and your end user governance. So your operational governance is quite technical focused. It'd be things like how long is content retained for in regards to backups? What's the performance like of the network? What are the other SLAs that as a IT department we're sort of being held accountable to? Classification of content, records management, data loss prevention, things like that. So on the other side of that, we have the end user governance. So this is a lot more specific and revolves around what applications are end users able to use, and more importantly, how do we want them to use them? So one of the things that we can do is put a repeatable framework or approach in how we want users to consume these applications, such as Teams, OneDrive, things like that. So if we do that, IT can ensure that those sort of applications continue to provide value as they are organized, maintained, and provide a consistent end user experience. The final ones that we sort of have here, let's click on the slide, is, and sort of Loryan mentioned this a little bit before, are the applications that may not be controlled by IT, otherwise known as shadow IT. Look, some of these applications get spun up because end users are trying to do their job, or in this case, within education, it could be students want to share files with each other, but there's no easy way to be able to do that, or if they've got really large media or illustrations or things like that. So what would typically happen is they'd go via IT, they'd say, okay, you need to install an FTP client, you've got to install a VPN, and 45 steps later to try and do what you need to do, and it just becomes too hard. That's why things like Dropbox and they got really, really popular. So look, to ensure those sort of things don't happen, and one of the most common ones that we're seeing these days is where all those sort of teams get created and IT have a bit of a panic moment, go, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to control this, I'm just going to turn it off so the mess doesn't get any worse. As soon as that happens, these other systems come into play. So one of the things where AvePoint sits across all of this is being able to put a consistent approach that allows IT to put the controls in place that they require. So, but without inhibiting or slowing down how end users are, what they want to do, which is that they want to use this fantastic tool. I've been to so many education institutions where this IT is saying, we are getting asked daily by students and by teachers going, why can't we use Teams? Why have you turned this off? And it's because they don't have that control in place. So that's where we're certainly able to sort of fit within there and ensure that they have that control so students and teachers are able to get the value out of that investment. Okay, so what are some of the common service delivery concerns that we see, particularly with teams in the education space? So one of the common ones is the provisioning. So as a lot of us probably on the call have already seen, where you can go into Teams and it's quite easy and simple. A couple of clicks, you can get a team up and running really, really quickly. Now, part of the challenge with that is you have that sprawl that can happen. So I mentioned before about one of the universities having 600 teams created in a really short period of time with there was no launch or anything like that. Part of it as well is you often see sort of duplication of teams. So if people just go follow that traditional interface, there's no sort of real way to see if a team that already exists that they could be using instead that meets those requirements. I often see the one where there may be a HR or human resources or people and culture. So having the same team 3 times with different names and naming conventions. Putting some controls around the appropriateness of the names as well. There was one school in Perth, actually, where I am at the moment, that actually the IT department we had to turn off the creation of teams after the students created a team called the Naughty Corner. So that was kind of the impetus to them going, we actually need some help with this to put some controls around it. naming conventions. So one of the things that we're in the process of implementing for a university is when a student requests a new team, so it could be for a project or things like that, what we do is we look up the student's class that they're in via Azure AD, so it's an attribute usually stored in there, and then we use that ID as a part of the naming convention for the group. So every group that's created by a student in a particular class has that same sort of convention. So using our groups hub feature, what we're able to do then is group and sort all those sorts of like groups. So students are able to go in and be able to see all the groups that are created by students within the same classes and decide if they want to join that or not. We can also use that this approach, so we can give teachers the delegated permission, and they're the ones that decide if teams need to be created for that particular class or not. So we're taking that sort of burden of IT and actually empowering the students and the staff to be able to determine, do we actually need this particular team? And what often happens in that particular scenario is that the teacher will go, well, there's already a team that exists for that particular project, use this one instead. So you can do all that via our software and form and process. So you're not, but it goes back to what I was saying before, no one's going out there to deliberately go and create a sprawl and a mess of teams. People just want to do what they need to do, be that work on a project, collaborate, things like that. So directing them to a team that may already exist is an acceptable outcome, and it's one that they'll be absolutely fine with. They don't have to have a new one every single time. Management. So being able to monitor for usage and adoption. So one of the things that we get asked for all the time is that when we get brought in and there's been a whole bunch of teams and groups created and go, well, what do we don't know which ones we can keep. Can we can't delete them all because there could be content in there of value. What do we do? So we're actually able to ingest all those teams into our software and run what's called a recertification process. So there's a couple of things that we can do for that. We can sort of provide some reporting, monitor the audit logs and things like that, and actually say, are people actually using this team? Now, the next part of that we can do as well as a recertification process. So every year, you know, students change classes and teachers change and things like that. Or if you take it up to a higher level and you're thinking about, say, if there was a specific project or initiative, there could be a whole heap of users that have been added to that particular team, but over time, they may no longer require access. So we can actually automate a process where a report is sent and an action to the owner of that particular team go, confirm that these people still need access to this content. And it's a simple tick box, yes, no, add the people. That's all monitored and audited. So if you're looking at compliance and things like that, you can ensure that, okay, we're regularly checking and we're validating that the right people have access to this information. Now, the lifecycle team. So how do I retain, expire, or dispose of teams as appropriate? So one of the things that sort of comes up a lot, and I used the example before, is like, okay, there's a whole bunch of teams here. Do I need all of these going forward? Do I need to be backing up, 600 to 800 teams? So one of the things that we do when the team is provisioned, and we use the example before of when a student is doing it, or if a teacher is requesting the team, we may ask them certain questions. So it's a bit more of a questionnaire. So we're directing them down a path instead of using the native new team button. We get them to fill out a questionnaire or a form, and we can often display this quite prominently in the waffle, things like that. And depending on the way they answer, we will apply information management policies to that. So if it's a team that's required for that class for the year, we may go, well, we need to keep that content for 7 years because we've got certain regulatory requirements for retaining that information. But if the team is, say, instead for a bunch of like-minded teachers arranging an excursion, that could be more of an ad hoc team. So we could dispose of at the end of the year. But by asking these questions, we can put these disposal schedules automatically in place. So IT don't have to actually do anything. The content will be disposed of and the team will be archived, or whatever actions need to be done automatically based on that. So the end user who's requesting the team doesn't actually know that they're partaking in this, but by answering the questions in a certain way, we're able to apply those policies to ensure that we're compliant and we're tidying up teams overall that may or may not be required going forward. So look, where we're effectively trying to get to with the overall sort of life cycle management of teams and groups. Look, so what I've got sort of on the screen here at the moment, this is effectively the native out of the box process where you go request a new team, you can either change the owner, add or remove people, and delete it. That's effectively it. That's all really the controls that you've got. What we're aiming to do and what our AvePoint online services governance automation software allows us to do is to be able to have an entire lifecycle management around the birth of a team through to that end of life. So the requesting of that workload, the validating the request. So who's requesting? Are they actually allowed to request this? Through to the active life cycle of that particular group, you know, whether that's changing permissions, adding or removing users, or changing the ownership of that particular team, through to decommissioning it, eventually archiving it off, and then disposing of it in a controlled, automated fashion. So IT aren't in there having to run scripts to do cleanups, things like that. And we can confidently know hand on heart that we're not getting rid of anything that we shouldn't be getting rid of. And with that, I will hand over to Matt.
Awesome, thanks. Looks like hey, Lauren, it doesn't seem like I can control the slides here, so I might have you walk me through it.
Sure thing.
All right. So what we're going to touch on today is kind of along the same lines that Daryl talked about, but kind of diving a little bit deeper and looking at the content and giving institutions visibility, culture, and compliance protection for the content that's in flight within teams. So I know there's been a couple questions around keeping students and teachers and faculty conversations in the right place, whether it's chat or group setting and group channels. So go to the next slide. Might have it here. Now. Yeah, we'll try it here. So I think the most common thing we see is these two needs, and I know they've been talked about kind of throughout the theme of this presentation, but the theme of collaboration and IT leaders and collaboration and communication leaders wanting to introduce teams within their institution. And then the faculty and the students and the teachers are all wanting this consumer-like experience that they're used to on WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or whatever it is that they use on their day-to-day kind of social lives. So they want this easier way to collaborate. And oftentimes this is great, but oftentimes we start seeing these barriers to adoption that come from leaders in HR, chief information security officers, compliance officers, legal, CIOs, often start to bring up these questions when it comes to rolling out a new product, sometimes shadow IT-like, as Loryan kind of spoke of, that leads to a lot of unstructured conversational data within your institution. So really our company was founded on this. We had a collaboration leader who's our CEO wanting to roll out, at the time, Yammer, but now we're hearing a lot of the same issues when rolling out something like a Teams. So what we've built is our Whereby Wiretap platform that really enables safe collaboration within Teams and Yammer, and really also allows you to take control of the data that lives in Teams, but also protect the data and the people. And we're going to kind of focus in on that right side of the screen, which is all around kind of going beyond the data loss prevention aspect, but also culture protection. Protecting people is a big part of what we provide for. And again, not to scare you, but really just focusing on the reality of people in these kind of short, sometimes social chat settings. There's a lot of conversations that might go undetected or in private conversations. We've done analysis on over 20 million enterprise communication messages, and some key findings around, things like 1 out of every 7 people exclusively use the chat conversations, which aren't visible in public channels and sometimes private channels. 43% of all messages are in private. And this is where we see a lot of the most of the toxicity or bullying that might happen from a culture protection side of things is in these private conversations, which an admin even doesn't have access to. And again, not to scare people trying to roll out teams, but we really want to make them risk aware of some of these human behavior tendencies that do happen. Oftentimes, it's a few bad apples within an institution, within a company. And the last thing we want is for all this work to be done, rolling out teams, having the change management in place, educating your users, and you get a year down the road, and all of a sudden you have one bad apple that does something in teams that ruins it for everybody, ruins collaboration for everybody, and ruins the experience for teachers and staff that were using it in a very positive way. And unfortunately, we've seen this. And it's because companies just didn't have the right controls in place for the content that's being passed through their teams and collaboration environments. So what we've built is one of our modules is our monitoring product, and you can think of this as a automated community moderator, and it's a very easy setup. And you can start thinking of all the things that you might be able to do for your institution, whether it is, provide safe collaboration, or it's protecting institutional knowledge, right? With things that are being created within institutions. These are all very important things. And oftentimes they're sometimes unintentionally shared to the wrong place or done in a private setting where people think it's, okay to do it. Where really we're giving you the controls in place to configure pretty much a rule engine, but it's a dynamic rule engine that goes beyond keyword monitoring. So we allow you to specify specific groups or teams within teams or Yammer, specify certain individuals or groups based on Active Directory, allow you to choose from a set of patterns or keywords, whether it's sensitive data or sexual harassment. We've already created those out-of-the-box condition lists for our customers. Really, this is where you would also use the tool to set up whether or not you want to look at uploaded content into Teams, and this includes images. You can use and statements, and we're also getting into the human behavior side of things, which touches on that culture protection, which is understanding sentiment and toxic speech and not safe for work images. These are all proprietary models that are built around collaboration data. And so when we apply it to collaboration, it gives you smart detection and lowers those false positives when looking at the content that's being created on Teams. So once you set up a rule, you turn it on, and this can monitor everything from a very specific team to everything. And this includes guest access. And so we're looking at it 24/7. Again, think of this as that automated community manager. And if something is found, we don't just block it. We don't block the content, which actually sometimes produces more shadow IT. We actually want to create value. So we have automated actions that are, as simple as flagging it in our system to tagging it. So auto hashtagging, I know that feature has been talked about in Teams. It's in Yammer, just to make that content more dynamic. You can notify an individual. So maybe it's a specific rule about a specific team that has a specific teacher. You can notify that teacher automatically. We have a coaching functionality. Oftentimes, like I mentioned, some of this data, whether it's sensitive or inappropriate, gets put in a public channel. Oftentimes, the individual didn't mean to do that. You can use this as a coaching opportunity by detecting this content and notifying them instead of just removing it and them not knowing why they shouldn't have posted it there. We can obviously delete, or we can kick off a workflow that's based off the organizational needs. So I talked a little bit about the AI, and shield your eyes if this might be a little offensive, but it is a real message that we were actually able to detect utilizing our proprietary toxic speech model. And the message, they're both the same message, but the one on the left would have never been caught by just the keywords detection that you might find in a very off-the-shelf keyword monitoring product. But with applying our AI to it and our toxic speech model, we were able to find this very offensive and sexual in nature comment, and we actually got ahead of this situation that would have potentially turned into a harassment situation, and we were able to allow the company to intervene before it got worse. And really, lastly, I think showing the UI, anybody can do it. The faculty can do it. This doesn't require IT. I mentioned before that we have over 100 out-of-the-box condition lists that allow a company to protect their culture, to comply with occupational health and safety regulations, with protecting the people in your organization. From bullying, from again exposing institutional data that shouldn't be exposed, and really providing this objective evidence and protecting your people's not just physical safety but psychological safety, and that's a core thing of what we're doing with our Aware by Wiretap platform. And lastly, you know, we have advanced reporting, reporting that shows not only incidents that might happen in the product, but also your overall sentiment over time. So having a pulse on your institutional sentiment, understanding when something might happen, what the reaction is. And this is capabilities that we'll continue to enhance within our monitoring product, but also within our kind of dedicated culture protection product that we'll be launching at the beginning of this year. And real quick, we service customers worldwide. Our sweet spot is collaboration data and conversational data. We're a Microsoft partner. We know collaboration, and Gartner recognizes us as kind of being a cool vendor in the unified communication and collaboration space. And again, at the end of the day, we want to reduce barriers to adoption and enable safe collaboration so that teams can not just be held back and maybe only to teachers, but you can give it to faculty, you can give it to staff, you can give it to students, and you can potentially, you know, give it to student parents or teachers. So we want everybody collaborating on teams, and we want them to be able to do it in a safe and secure way.
Thanks, Matt. So bringing, I guess, all of this together, obviously both AvePoint and Wiretap are add-on solutions that really extend. Oops, what's going on here? That extend the apologies. What's happened to my slide there? There we go. That extend the team's platform. So while you can do a lot of these out of the box, they only go so far. So these really go to that extra length to address the needs that we're seeing in the education space around deployment to thousands of people, as well as ensuring safety of students as well. So in terms of how much these things can actually cost, now a lot of organizations can quite easily go out there and find a blog that explains how to build a team's provisioning engine. And when you stitch all this together, the reality is there's a number of different tools that you need to be able to be familiar with in order to make it work. So you need things like Power Apps to be the front end form that is published to end users, a SharePoint list that is actually behind the Power App form that keeps a listing of all the groups and who the owners are and all the requests, Microsoft Flow to perform the actual approval workflow, Azure Functions to actually go and perform the task, and then the Microsoft Graph API to go and execute the services in the back end. The reality is that this actually, as I said, takes 5 different skills and levels of code that needed to be known. There's also an Azure subscription there, so you're paying for that particular service. And realistically, it takes at least 5 days to build this out. That is just the building of a provisioning approval process only. There's very little customization that's possible, and there's really no support beyond just that provisioning. So we did some analysis on the average salary of an IT engineer working inside of an education institution, and looked to say that it basically ended up costing about $1,500, which seems quite cheap. But as I said, the only thing that does is provisioning approval, which is a very, very, very small piece of the pie. So as Daryl explained, we have to look at not just the provisioning, but also the ongoing management and also the disposition of teams towards the end. So one of the things to be cognizant of is from a licensing perspective, AvePoint only charges for the faculty, not the actual students themselves. So is quite cost effective. With Wiretap, we have to look at a different type of model. So this is less technical because Wiretap offers features and services that are simply not existent in Teams and Office 365 because it goes above and beyond that. So what we need to look at is how much does a bullying case cost us in terms of staff time to sit down and bring the parents in, to bring the students in, and to deal with this situation. We have to look at any potential legal fees depending on the school and how the severity of the case, and any costs that come from that. You know, potentially it might just be a letter from a lawyer, or just have a lawyer present in the meeting. So dealing with that. But then the bigger and harder to track costs come from things like brand and reputational damage. So how does it affect it when, you know, when the school actually has its name in, you know, spoken about, but also in the print media, talking about how there was a sexual harassment case or bullying or, you know, suicide or worse scenario. So that's the thing, is these are costs that we can't tap, but they can potentially lead to a loss of enrollments. And it's quite easy to have, you know, potentially a couple of students that don't enroll for the school year can actually quite easily offset the cost potentially of wiretap. So that's the thing, is we have to look at, you know, how this actually affects the organization, not just from the cost from an enrollment perspective, from the culture as well of people.
And one question we get, Loryan, real quick, that I think is worth addressing too is, you know, how are you different from a Teams DLP or out of the box solutions? And I think you hit it well with a lot of the culture protection we're doing around bullying and other toxic situations. But also, you know, the cost savings, or your faculty might not all be on E3 or even E5 license for the DLP, and you probably have a lot of E1 or F1 license types, and we don't want to limit collaboration just for regulation reasons, for protection reasons. We want to enable it for everybody, and we cover all license types, and so we complement, you know, the Microsoft suite well in that aspect.
And actually, something I was going to add is that both the AvePoint and wiretap solutions actually work with Yammer as well, so not just Teams. So if you already have an investment in those platforms, or you plan to use both platforms, the solution can actually work across both of them. So in terms of next steps, we'll jump into the questions and answers in a few moments. We have an AvePoint, more of a governance deep dive coming up in a couple of weeks that I'll share more in a few moments. Similar with wiretap, so in these particular sessions, we'll actually go through some demos and actually show how these particular things work in a bit more detail. Obviously, we can't jam them all into this one-hour webinar. And also, you know, to arrange, I guess, a custom demonstration or presentation, feel free to give us a call if you're wherever you're at with your Teams journey, whether you're at the start and contemplating whether you should be doing it, or whether you're full into it, and like many institutions I've spoken to, now need to do a bit of a cleanup to figure out how they actually address it going forward. So this is the webinar that's coming up on Tuesday, October 30th. So save the date for that. That'll be 10:30 Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time. So basically the same time as this webinar. We'll have somebody different from Microsoft and AvePoint on the session, but that's on October 30th. The wiretap webinar will most likely be Wednesday, October 31st, same time as well. But we'll send out registration links for this, as well as more information afterwards, as well as the ebook around Teams and education that I wrote with wiretap. So there, our contact details are up on the screen, and now what we'll do is hand over to any questions that have been asked in the Q&A panel. So Stuart was handling those in the background. So Stuart, if you can tell us who's asked what.
Thanks, Loryan. I think we had a few issues with the ebook link. So Joanne has pasted a correct link in there, but likely the original link will work when AvePoint are just sorting out some auto redirect on their CDN, so that should work shortly. If not, there's a direct link to the PDF in the Q&A. One of the big questions was around Teams data sovereignty. Where's Teams is actually stored? So I think I'll just hand over quickly to Loryan to talk about that. I think there's the Go Local movement as well coming through.
Yeah, so that's a good question and a very pertinent one. So as of only, I think, a few weeks ago, data sovereignty for Teams was addressed in that Go Local, as Stuart mentioned, so that the data is actually hosted in Australia. However, that's only for organizations that have only started using Teams from that point. So if you've already been using Teams data, that's already been stored outside of Australia. Not all of the data is stored outside of Australia because Teams sits on top of SharePoint and Exchange. So your files are already in SharePoint, which is in Australia. Your conversations are also inside of your mailbox, which is also in Australia. It's just some other bits, so some transactional conversations and the e-discovery components and images and those kind of things have been stored outside of Australia. There is going to be, at some point in 2019, a movement to bring those, to migrate those into Australia. However, if you're an organization that has barely used Teams and wants to use it, but wants the data to be in Australia, we can work with Microsoft to effectively wipe your Teams instance currently and start afresh in the Australian data center. So feel free to contact me after that if that's a concern.
Okay. The next one was, how do you keep staff and students separate in the people picker in Teams? So maybe just touch briefly on that in terms of, I think the use case would be to prevent teachers from talking to students, etc.
Unfortunately, it's one of the challenges that you have of having everybody in the same Office 365 tenant. There are some organizations, some institutions where I've seen them have a separate Office 365 tenant just for faculty and another one for students along with their teachers. But the reality is that Office 365 is designed to be a collaborative experience. So segregating people and having them not able to see each other is unfortunately against how the product is designed. So it's not something that can easily be achieved out of the box. There are certain things that can be done in terms of global address list segregation, but that doesn't really flow into Teams. So unfortunately not an easy answer there.
Cool. The next question was from David around do applications that are available to add to Teams, do they have their own T's and C's, and how do we ensure teachers don't add, a third-party application that they're not supposed to?
This is a very, very pertinent question because absolutely any application that is not a Microsoft one definitely has its own T's and C's that needs to be adhered to and understood as to where the data for that application sits and what data it actually reads. One way is to simply turn the applications off at an organizational level, but this is where the provisioning engine can come into to help control as to which teams have access to what. So this is definitely an IT level control that you need a governance plan to address how you do that. One approach is to disable the ability for anybody to add apps and simply have IT control that. Others can be allow people to do it, but manage it kind of retroactively.
Cool. The next one was, is it correct the only way to currently prevent and control team creation is to restrict who can create groups in Office 365?
Out of the box, yes, that is absolutely right, unless you invest in a proper provisioning solution such as the one that Daryl covered off. The problem is, though, actually, to add an extra point to that, if you control who creates groups just to control the Teams aspect, that will impact everything in Office 365 that uses groups, and that is more than Teams. So we're talking about Planner, we're talking about Staff Hub, we're talking about Stream, Power BI, and about half a dozen other ones as well.
Cool. There's a question around AvPoint costs. So Craig, I'd suggest either emailing Loryan directly or Daryl on their contact details are on the screen now. And they can give you some indications around the costing. As per it was, it is FTE, based on FTE, but I'm not sure. Loryan, do you know if it's teaching FTE or admin FTE?
That's a Daryl question.
Yeah, look, the best thing to do is to reach out to me via email. That's one of those sort of things, depending on the institution, things like that. We can certainly come up with something.
Cool. Craig asked a question for, out of the box, what are the protections around staff deleting teams, and what limitations do we have for the recovery and restore? Do any third-party backup systems such as Backupify natively understand Teams?
This is a really good question because Teams has the ability to delete a team, to archive a team, and even to restore it within 30 days. The problem is, though, that a lot of those controls are for Teams only. So if you've been using the SharePoint functionality that is also attached to the group, which is attached to the team, you don't necessarily get that back. or when you archive it on the archives, the team itself. So this is where AvePoint comes in. AvePoint has a backup solution as well that integrates in with cloud governance to ensure that if a team gets deleted, then it's actually still there and it can be restored from.
I think just to add to that is, if you've got protections and retention policies around the underlying objects like SharePoint and Exchange, then that they have their own retention mechanisms as well. So you can cater for that. Another one is from Stuart. Users of Teams seem to be added individually from the group, and membership is not synced into Teams as group changes occur.
There has been some lag. It's actually documented because of the platform being so big. It sometimes can take up to 24 hours for a user that's been added to a group to actually be added to a team, versus if you add them from the Teams engine. This is again where the AvePoint solution kind of does it behind the scenes, so it does it directly. So if you add somebody from that system, it will put them into all facets of it.
Cool. And there was just a comment from Will saying, I thought we were covering off more of the actual Teams product capabilities in regards to compliance. I think the point of this webinar is to all the products and stuff that Loryan and the guys have taken through today is stuff that Teams can't do out of the box. So that's the point of these third-party additions is to give functionality that's not available in the base product. But like Dan says, there's actually Microsoft Education Meets available. They do regular webinars and talk about the base compliance things, and they also have some learning consultants that can come out to schools or universities to talk about the features that are inherent in the platform.
Well, that be for questions.
I think that's it. There's a question around. Just one last question from Anna, which was, do you have any experience in a business case where you want to migrate some existing SharePoint team sites into Microsoft Teams so they gain the extra functionality and interface, but retain the existing document library and storage?
Really good question, very pertinent, because a lot of organizations and institutions already have used SharePoint team sites and now want to add that Teams functionality. So there is the ability to groupify, which is basically connecting a group to an existing SharePoint team site, and then you can attach a team on top of that, which seems a little bit multi-step. One of the features that was announced at Ignite is the ability to teamify a SharePoint team site. Not sure of the exact date of when that's coming. That being said, though, it is something that we have done where we worked with organizations that have already used SharePoint, and we can make teams be aware of that existing SharePoint instance, or actually, move the content across to match the channel structure and things like that.
Awesome. So we're running a couple of minutes over time. I think that's it for questions. The guys' details have been up on the screen for a fair while. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out direct. Loryan will do a mail out with some resources and the AvePoint education white paper after this. And if you've got any other questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we can help you with your team's journey. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.